It's the week ending, Saturday the 19th of January, and this is The Week Unwrapped, brought to you by Barclays Corporate Banking. In the past 7 days, we've seen Theresa May's government losing its key Brexit vote by a record-breaking margin, Somali Islamists killing 21, with many more still missing at a siege in Kenya, and Donald Trump staving off the shutdown by buying in McDonald's for the White House staff. But we're here to bring you some of the stories that passed under the radar this week. Big news not making headlines right now, but with repercussions for all our lives. I'm Olly Mann, and let's unwrap the week. And joining me today from the week's digital team are Holly Clements, Arian McNichol and Rebecca Gilley. And starting the show this week is Arian. Please bear in mind, we're not going to be talking about Brexit for the entire show. That is an Olly Mann guarantee. Arian, what do you think this week should be remembered for?
Well, from this week, we're going to hear the drums echoing not just tonight, but every night.
A bizarre clip, Arian, even by your own standards. Biggest news story of the week. That was the hit song Africa by Toto, but apparently recorded in some wind.
That's right.
Why?
So, in fact, what you're listening to there is the artwork of a chap called Max Siedentopf, who put together this installation in the deserts of Namibia that features an iPod powered by solar power, surrounded by 6 white plinths, on each of which there's a speaker. And the idea of the artwork is that it's going to play Toto's Africa into the desert forever.
Regardless of any referendum result.
Exactly.
Okay.
Doesn't matter what happens.
And why is that your story of the week?
It's
an art installation that plays Toto by Africa forever.
Yeah, two reasons actually. One, Toto's Africa has become regarded as the internet's favourite song. Rolling Stone said that nothing sums up 2018 like Toto's Africa.
Rebecca, as our resident millennial, can you verify that?
Absolutely. We're all mad for it.
Okay, fine. Arian, continue.
Double the number of plays last year than the previous year, and only seems to be on this upward trajectory. So there's this sort of weird moment of infatuation with the song itself.
It's the Rick-rolling of 2019.
Yeah, exactly. It's sort of got this kind of don't stop believing, harking back to the 80s, a simpler time.
Okay, news story of the week.
It.
The second reason better be good.
The second reason is that it coincides with this very interesting article I read on the BBC website by Richard Fisher, which I sort of felt deserved a little bit more attention than it has got. It was called The Perils of Short-Termism, Civilization's Greatest Threat. And it's all about the way that our short-term thinking, and particularly useful in a week like we've just had, is one of the greatest problems that not just this generation of humans is facing, but all future generations. And it's a problem that humans have due to our propensity to think about immediate problems and immediate solutions, not thinking of the fact that there's not just the 7.7 billion people on Earth right now that we should be considering when we make particularly political decisions, but the humans to come, as it were.
Okay. And if that is the case, if long-term problems are the thing that imperil humanity more than anything we're thinking about in the short term, Holly, what can we do to change the way we approach them? Because as Arian says, it is sort of innate to the way we think, to think about the short term.
I think the people that are arguing against short-termism are hoping that governments will find a way of looking forward without losing popularity. I guess that is the problem with the way democracy is set up. We're not set up to think long-term because it doesn't really appeal to people. Finland and Sweden have already got parliamentary advisory groups to foster long-term planning, and other countries are looking at. Wales has also got a commissioner that particularly looks at future generations.
I've met her.
Yes, I heard your voice as I listened to her podcast this morning. It was very disconcerting.
The BBC's Forethought podcast, everyone. Available from all good podcast retailers.
It's an interesting concept that I found fascinating to read this Richard Fisher article. I hadn't really thought about it in the same terms. He'd come out with a few comparisons that made me think about it differently. There's one comparing it to the narrow view that wealthy people might have when they can't really see beyond their own social circles. Our present group of humans can't really see beyond our time period. And they've got quite a fascinating graphic where there's this tiny dot of 7.7 billion people that are alive today compared to this massive 6.75 trillion unborn people of the future. And funny how we weigh up that tiny dot as being more important just because we're all alive today.
And unless you see that visualization, Rebecca, maybe it is genuinely quite hard for us to visualize. It is just something you can't get out of, that you think about yourself and your children, you don't think generations ahead.
Yeah, I mean, he compares it to how when Australia was discovered, it was considered an empty terrain where, you could just unload all of your unwanted convicts, etc. And that we look at the future as a kind of empty space where we can unload all our problems into the future. But he suggests, and which I think is quite compelling, is that it's difficult for us to envision, not just, practically, it's hard to imagine abstract things like, generations, like 10 generations in the future, but also because it reminds us of our own mortality, and we don't want to dwell on the fact that we'll be long dead at this point. But I think that one of the ways that one of the main aspects of short-termism that he talks about is climate change. I think it's really important to consider that idea that we are just ignoring future generations in a kind of selfish manner, because I think too often we excuse ourselves saying, oh, it's too overwhelming to think about, or like, where would we start, blah, blah, blah. But, we've been constantly being told by experts, this is how much these are the radical steps we need to take, and we need to take them now. But nobody really wants to. So,
OK, the general population might find it hard. But Arian, with politicians, if that's what we're talking about here, political decisions being made long term, surely world leaders are very concerned about how the history books see them. Actually, it should be a natural thing for them to think, how's this going to look in 100 years?
Well, yes and no, because, of course, the first impulse of a politician is usually to get re-elected or to maintain their grip on power, however they got power. So usually they're thinking only as long as the current election cycle. And so they tend to think in ways that benefit the people here and now, and particularly the people who are going to vote for them. A couple of weeks we were talking about drilling for oil in Alaska, and Olly, you said you can understand why Trump wants to do that, because it's popular with people to bring oil prices down. But of course, that's to take the very here and now view rather than the macro view. And so I think, yes, you're right. Of course, a politician wants to be remembered kindly, but firstly, they want to, maintain their position in society right now.
I think one of the possible solutions to short-termism in general is to be found in behavioural economics. It's like a field that I've kind of got quite interested in recently, basically about how humans don't really behave in ways that match economic models, and that this often is often the undoing of perfectly good policy ideas. One of the things about it is that you can is that people don't tend to think in the long term, but you can make them act in ways that are better for them in the long term. There's this thing called nudge theory. The economist Richard Thaler won a Nobel Prize basically for his work on this. And one of the main examples of the way this is used is auto-enrollment in pensions. If people are left to their own devices as they were and could choose whether or not to contribute to a pension, most people did not do it. And now that it's been changed to auto-enrollment, very few people choose to opt out. So without them really noticing the difference, they have, if you like, made a decision which will be good for them in the long term. And people use the same argument for organ donation as well, that if it was opt out, most people would choose not to opt out, and we'd have far more organs available for recipients. So I think there are ways to change people's behaviour, even if they are still thinking in the short term. There are ways to modify their behaviour towards the long term.
And I think the other thing that Richard Fisher talks about in his article is that people aren't so swayed by philosophical arguments and evidence-based arguments as they are by things that are a bit more sort of emotional. And I think that's where things like this project from Max Siedentopf come in, where they're trying to address a broader question, something about, there is something compelling about this dumb pop song being played in the middle of the desert for eternity. It's an interesting thing to grapple with. And there's a couple of other cultural projects that Fisher drew out that are doing similar things. The most interesting of which was this project by Jeff Bezos to build a mechanical clock that will tick for 10,000 years. He's buried it into the side of this mountain. It's this massive mechanism. And the idea is that it makes us stop thinking about ourselves in 2019, but in the context of kind of a 10,000 year period. And there are some people who are involved with the project who have stopped referring to the year as 2019, but put a zero on the front, so it's 2019. And it kind of puts things, it helps in that same act of putting things into that broader context.
Do you actually, I mean, having said that this article on the BBC's website didn't get as much attention as you'd have liked, and the point that it's making is that long-term thinking isn't getting as much traction as you'd have liked, you've actually just come up with a couple of examples there of people doing things that are thinking far ahead. Do you think the trend might be that now when people are building infrastructure, when people are planning economic policy, maybe post-Brexit, sorry for saying the B word, people start thinking, OK, let's not worry about our immediate future. Let's think about the things that are going to still matter in a generation to come.
You'd hope so. I don't think so. I don't think we're there yet. And I think that the fact that, well, I certainly hadn't heard about this 10,000-year clock until I started doing research around this subject. You know, it's an idea that does get your attention, and it's interesting once you've heard about it, but I don't know that it's necessarily going to be the thing that, even if enough people do hear about it, makes us stop and do the right thing for future generations immediately. We need sort of broaden our approach in how to tackle these problems, and we need more people thinking about it.
I don't know if you saw, Holly, the conclusion of this group of scientists in Scandinavia that met up to discuss the long term. They worked out 4 different models. Did you see that?
Yeah, that's what I was just going to bring up, actually.
Because that's what sticks with me.
I was thinking that we should take some responsibility as journalists, because these 4 kind of outcomes of the world could be the status quo, what we have now.
Which they basically said won't happen.
Yeah, which won't happen. More likely, technological transformation, where we learn to live for longer and have a bigger population.
Which might happen a bit.
An astronomical transformation, where we go and live on different planets.
Which, if you think forward enough, is more likely than not.
Perhaps. And then catastrophe.
Catastrophe. So basically they're saying we're all going to go and live on Venus, or we're all going to die. That's not being reported much, is it? Are you talking about big stories?
I feel like Daily Express has got that covered of World War III every day. And I think that is a bit of our fault, that we make everyone so pessimistic about the future that maybe people just can't bear to think about it. They don't have the hope that people will still be alive in 10,000 years.
But the models can change. That's the point, isn't it? The models are based on what we know about humans now.
It seems quite easy when you look at the kind of graphic they made to represent this, that you can, it's kind of like snakes and ladders, and you can slip quite easily from any of the other 3 trajectories into catastrophe.
Hilariously, the associated articles, like the related articles on the BBC article by Fisher, that said, just sort of in passing, that I think might have been generated automatically, it said, you might also like how Western civilization could collapse, the uncertain future of democracy, and the mystery viruses far worse than flu.
Okay, well, you might also like Holly's story of the week. That's up next after this. Holly, what do you think this week will be remembered for?
Have school inspectors finally learned their lesson?
If you have a real focus, real strength in your curriculum and teaching, then good test results drop out of it. But the other way round isn't always true. Just focusing on the test can often lead to a lot of things falling by the wayside. And that's what we're concerned about and what we're seeing primary, lower secondary and upper secondary. So I really want this message to get out.
So those schools who, through necessity, have had to focus on getting kids through the SATs and trying to get as high as possible in the league table, are you asking them to sacrifice some of that in order to broaden education, even if it comes at the expense of the reputation of the school?
No, I'm saying don't focus too narrowly on the test by really thinking about what is the whole curriculum, what's the experience the child should be getting in that whole curriculum, and good test results flow from that. We see the schools that are confident, the schools that really approach the curriculum in the right spirit, in the full spirit, actually do very well. There isn't a tension here.
Her Majesty's Chief Inspector of Schools, Amanda Spielman, banging the drum for this week's policy on BBC Radio 5 Live a while ago. And Holly, that new policy is that Ofsted, the body that regulates schools in the UK, they want less focus on exams.
Yes, they've published their proposals for a new way of inspecting schools this week, which takes the shift away from the exams and it wants to focus more on how the schools are actually teaching. So it's trying to avoid schools gaming the system and narrowing pupils' education.
Which, I mean, I don't know if you know any teachers, but I hear a lot from friends that I know that is a huge issue.
Yeah, of course. I spoke to teachers this week about it just to kind of gauge the view. And I think it was positively received, but a lot questioned how that would actually come into practice. And obviously there's a blame on Ofsted for bringing that in the first place. And they haven't got rid of certain things, such as their system of grading, such as outstanding to inadequate. And that ultimately is still there. So whether schools will change completely, is another question.
School league tables aren't going away as part of this system, are they? And that's really about academic attainment. It's not about how pupils have improved or how hardworking the teachers are.
Yeah, they're not doing away with tests and test results altogether, and I think parents will always look at that side of things. But I think the tests kind of overlook schools that are doing a really good job at helping pupils that maybe come from backgrounds where they weren't ever going to attain the A's. But that's completely missed out if you just look at the results.
Arian, you went to school in Australia.
I did.
What do you think about the British system as you see it coming over here and living here now, this emphasis that there has been on tests?
Well, it's not dissimilar to the Australian system, to be honest. I think that same push from even before primary school for kids to get into good primary schools and then primary schools to get kids into good high schools and the concern that people have around the quality of the school in their area and often then moving area to find better schools. I think it's the same in Australia as it is over here. And that's sort of a necessary part of what is driving this sort of test-based business that is now kind of trying to be addressed. And I think any moves away from it are laudable, but it's quite difficult because I think people do continue to want to know that the school that they send their kids to is a good one.
But is it difficult because you're trying to crystallise it down to a number and it's a thing that isn't a number?
Yeah, probably. And actually, a school's results may be something that you can determine, but the quality of the education is rather harder to determine. I think that's what they're trying to address with this.
So I wonder, actually, Rebecca, whether it's parents' fault in a way, and governments, but parents wanting this league table, wanting an answer, wanting a number, not bothering, frankly, to properly do the research, work out what school's right for their kid and how it is a holistic thing. It's not just about how they do in maths.
I don't know. I would agree with that, really. I think parents are very interested in the holistic experience, and you do often see parents saying that they want a school where pupils are well behaved, teachers are supportive, and theoretically I think these new Ofsted reforms are based on the slightly optimistic idea that if the school can fulfil all of these aspects that are now going to be more important in inspections, like behaviour, atmosphere in the school, etc., then attainment will go up naturally, which might be true and might not. There was a really good article in the Times Educational Supplement yesterday by Jeff Barton, who's General Secretary of the Association of School and College Leaders, where he basically says that these are good ideas and there's some really good stuff in there for teachers. For instance, inspectors are now going to interview teachers and try and get a picture of whether too much pressure is being put on them, because a lot of teachers have said they have no choice but to teach strictly to curriculum and teach to the test because of all the pressure that's put on them to get results. And basically he says these are good ideas, but there's a fundamental tension between this new direction that Ofsted's taking and the Department of Education, which is still incredibly focused on hard data and results. And this attitude of, I think, what the Department for Education would describe as academic rigor, this idea that people should be able to do X, Y, Z thing by this stage, rather than focusing, as Holly was talking about earlier, on the context that children are being taught in and their attainment kind of relative to their backgrounds. So there is kind of a bit of a tension at the heart of this.
But I think there's also a growing feeling that actually kids finding the school experience a pleasurable one and getting a rounded education actually contributes to the results of schooling itself. And that is becoming better known by looking at overseas models, like the fact that Finnish schools are often seen as the best schools in the world and have outperformed other schools around the world for years. And partly that's because they have less strict rules, more learning at your own pace, fewer hours in the day, less homework. And I think that this move by Ofsted is an attempt to try to introduce some of that thinking into the education system over here.
And also, Holly, there's the emphasis on different subjects under the current system, isn't there? Away from things like arts, for example, which people would say is useful to be a well-rounded person, even if you don't intend to have a career in arts, and towards things like maths and English, because you need to do it to get the marks.
Yeah, there was interesting wording. They said they were kind of complaining that some schools or colleges were offering popular subjects just to get more students in, presumably to pay fees. But I don't know, popular subjects doesn't necessarily mean bad in my head. If you're right, it could be arts or subjects that are not maths and science. I think there's kind of double standards of Ofsted. They're telling teachers not to judge pupils purely on data, but then they're going to still be judging those schools on those 4 outstanding to inadequate grades, and they've reduced the time that notice that they're going to give to schools before they come in to try and reduce the amount of bureaucracy and paperwork.
Oh, do you think so? I think it was just to catch them off guard.
Well, exactly, to catch them off guard, but then that
But
means
that's
they're going to
better,
have
isn't
to...
it? That's more honest.
In a way.
Inspectors in the building. I mean, you haven't got time, have you, to cover
You've
up?
barely got time to send all the bad kids out on an impromptu field
Usher them
trip.
into the cupboard.
I mean, I remember parents' days at my school. Suddenly, the flowers would go up in hanging baskets. I mean, there is a bit of duplicity there, isn't there?
Or will it be schools rushing to get all that paperwork throughout the year, just in case Ofsted come, paperwork that they don't really need to be doing just to tick boxes, and they'll have to have that every day of the year instead of just once.
Kind of on a similar note of, gaming the system, one of the kind of outcomes that Ofsted are hoping for from this de-emphasis on exam results is to cut the practice of off-rolling, which is when schools basically try and shove out kids who they think aren't going to get good grades at GCSE while they're still in year 10, so they'll never go into GCSE year. And this happens to thousands and thousands of pupils. Most of them do resurface either in other schools or sometimes in special education or homeschooling, but actually quite a large amount of pupils just kind of disappear and end up leaving school with no GCSEs. And so they are hoping to cut down on this. Obviously, it's obviously not allowed, but lots of schools have been able to get away with it. A lot of schools have been turning a blind eye because there is so much pressure to achieve those top results.
And the other thing that struck me as actually potentially welcome, I wonder if you agree, is when they assess the schools that had previously been ranked as good, they're now going to spend 2 days there rather than 1.
Yeah, I can't see any problem with them spending longer, but 2 days still seems like nothing.
Yeah, I was shocked. Were you shocked when you read that? So the school's good, yeah, I'll just go and check it. I have lunch there, it looks fine. That's not enough,
Got
is
lots
it?
of flowers up.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, yeah, exactly. It should be a week, surely, to properly inspect a school. I know they're professionals and they know what they're looking at, but...
I mean, I'm sure it boils down to them not having enough money to pay that many inspectors to see all schools. But yes, 2 days is nothing in a year of a school, let alone 7 years that you might spend. Every day is probably different.
Holly, if you were Her Majesty's Chief Inspector for the day, which I'm sure is something you fantasise about regularly, which one subject would you compel students to take?
Ooh, you're speaking to someone that loved English and not maths and science, but I see how important maths and science is. So... that's too hard. I mean, I would choose English, but if we got rid of all maths and science, then the world would be a sadder place.
I didn't say which one would you get rid of. I said which one would you compel students to take. Okay, so you agree with the law that currently exists that everyone has to do English?
Because then we can all communicate the other subjects together.
Arian?
I'd go drama and public speaking. I just think that it's an under-taught skill. Here it strikes me, but also in Australia I had the same thing. I'd want to introduce it there as a mandatory subject because I think that it's so important through the rest of your life to be able to express yourself, and there's too little emphasis on it.
But then some people some students are terrified by it, aren't they?
But I think that's because it's not something that they're compelled to do from a young age.
I was terrified by football, still had to bloody do it. Right. Rebecca, if you had to compel students to take a subject, what would it be?
First, you can tell that Arian was a massive show-off when he was at school. Probably foreign languages, so I don't feel so alone.
Yeah, you're literally all playing to your strengths rather than... You're saying I'd like all children to be like I was as a child. And then I'd feel less alone.
The ultimate problem probably with Ofsted and the government, that's what they've been doing, and we've all just done it.
Michael Gove wants every child to be a mini Michael Gove, and that truly is terrifying. One last story to come after this. And so finally this week, Rebecca, what do you think this week will be remembered for?
Should young people be protected from the darker side of sexuality?
Did you two do this to me? Are you two responsible for my nozzle being irrepressibly up?
Whoa. Easy, man. Easy.
Yeah, your nozzle's bent. Sorry. But you know what? You should be happy you're alive.
Yeah, Banana's whole face peeled off. Peanut Butter's wife is dead. Look at him. He's right there.
Hey! I'm gonna fix you. I'm gonna fix this. You think I give a about PB or J? This. I'm gonna kick your ass. How you like them apples?
Who, us?
No, not you. Come at me, bros.
Come at you? What does that mean?
Fine. You won't come at me? Well, then guess who's coming at you? Me! Yeah!
A clip there from the 2016 animated movie Sausage Party, starring Seth Rogen and Kristen Wiig. And legally, we're not allowed to use clips purely for illustrative purposes. So let's review the film. Who's seen Sausage Party?
I have seen it, and I'm desperately trying to remember what it was about. It was funny.
So it was
I think I
forgettable,
laughed.
Holly Clements thinks.
They go on an adventure. They realise that they're edible.
Who are they?
Vegetables.
They're vegetables, and that's who we
and
heard in the clip.
sausages, meat
Yeah.
products too. All products of a supermarket.
Yes.
They find out people eat them.
Crucially, it's a raunchy adult animated film, not as Holly was suspected.
My
a
memory.
kids' film.
Well, you
This is
saw
how
it,
well
you
I
didn't
remember the
realise.
film.
I mean, that clip surely explained.
There were a lot more swear words than I remember. I think maybe I had the sound turned down when I watched it.
Well, let's consider that our submission to be a new Film Critics Forum podcast. And Rebecca, tell us why you've chosen the clip.
So Sausage Party is one of the films that, if it were released now, would fall afoul of tighter classification guidelines from the British Board of Film Classification, which sets age ratings on films released in the cinema and on DVD, etc.
Okay, why? Why have they changed? And what direction?
It was released as a 15 when it came out in 2016.
So for foreign listeners, that means you have to be over the age of 15 to see it.
Yes, and it would now be classified as an 18, which I guess listeners can probably extrapolate the meaning of that one. And that is because it uses pornographic sexual language. Basically, the BBFC did this panel with consumers of film of different ages and asked them to give their opinions on the current guidelines and whether they were strict enough on things like violence, sex, etc. And the number one thing which came out of this panel was that people wanted to have tighter regulation on sexual violence and rape and pornographic language. So one of the things is that now films, you can still use swear words and be classified as 15, but if it uses aggressively sexual language or language associated with pornography, then it is now likely to be classified as an 18.
Okay, that's really interesting because, and in fact, if you're a podcast fan, do check out the BBFC's series of podcasts, which are excellent if you're interested in this kind of thing. I have listened over the years. Usually, it seems to me, they tend to be marking films down, if you like. Films that used to be an 18, something like The Terminator, for example, then gets rated as a 15 because people look at it and think no one really thinks that comic book violence is real anymore. A 15-year-old could see that. This is a rare example of...
Yeah, so it's a really interesting trend. And the other major change is that now films that depict rape or sexual violence will automatically be classified as 15 or above.
So do you have an example of a film with rape or sexual violence in it that was a PG or a 12?
Yes, I do. This was the example that the BBFC actually used themselves. The film The Duchess, starring Keira Knightley, which was released as a 12, contains a scene where she's held down on a bed and it's implied that she's about to be raped, although the rape itself isn't actually shown. And they use that as an example of a film that now be classified as 15.
And again, for foreign listeners, 12 actually means you don't have to be 12 to see it. You need to be accompanied by an
12A.
adult, but you can go at the age of 5 or 6 to watch a 12 certificate film.
Yeah, so while it's not explicit, it would now be restricted to people aged 15 or older. I just think it's a really interesting trend where, as you say, like the trend in the past has been we've become more permissive, liberal, starting in the 1950s and 60s, films have become full of more explicit sex and violence, and now we're seeing a bit of a backlash to that.
Arian.
Interesting to look straight back at the 1916 codification of what it was that...
what did they make of Sausage Party during the First World War?
They loved it. No, but for the first time, they tried to codify the things that they wouldn't allow in films. And there were 43 things, including indecorous dancing, that would be instantly cut from a film, the exhibition of profuse bleeding, I think that sort of makes sense, the modus operandi of criminals, I thought was an interesting one to cut out.
Beautifully phrased, isn't it?
Yeah, but interestingly also, one of them...
I'd love it if that came up on Netflix, wouldn't you, as a warning?
Yeah.
Contains references to the modus operandi of criminals.
Some things. But one that was particularly interesting was incidents indicating the actual perpetration of criminal assaults on women. So it's sort of a return to at least that idea of something that didn't belong in cinema.
And what it also is, Holly, is it is underlining that the BBFC clearly think they have a role in 2019, where a lot of people would say, actually, you can watch whatever you want on the internet. What's the point of trying to control, especially what children can see anyway? They're saying, not only do we have a role, there are certain areas where we should be more strict.
Yeah, I do think that is slightly at odds with the year. There was a historic high of people going to cinema just after the war, but that has dropped from 1.64 billion to 160 million or so today. I don't think that's where all young people are getting their movies from. I know lots of people that illegally download videos and movies and they wouldn't have any say over it. That doesn't matter what the certificate is. I'm not sure how many people it will actually impact that are just going to the cinema. The rest are getting it on the internet. I mean, it's good for parents to know easily see whether it's appropriate for their children to watch, but it depends if those parents are carefully watching their children.
And it's a bit of a grey zone because stuff like Netflix and Amazon Prime, they voluntarily do submit their content to the BBFC, but they don't have to do that. And obviously there's plenty of other places where people can go to watch content that is unrated and maybe unsuitable. But I think the thing that makes this interesting to me is that, you know, the guidelines that Arian read out, they were based on this idea of decency and decorum and, you know, what was inappropriate for people to be looking at in the cinema, whereas this is it seems to me like it's far more about protecting children from seeing kind of toxic depictions of sexuality. And I think in a way that's justified, because if you look back at the way things like rape and sexual violence have been depicted in film, often they have been depicted in a way that I think we now in this kind of Me Too era would look at as being highly irresponsible. I mean, the idea that female characters often have rape or sexual abuse as, you know, dramatic backstory just to motivate them in the film, gratuitous sexual violence. I mean, there are so many films I can think of, especially from, you know, like the 70s, 80s, where rape really is glamorized and it's
Go on, give us an example.
There's one that
Any
always
James Bond film.
Any James Bond film, for one. You know, there's so much. The idea that.
Are you suggesting James Bond rapes the Bond girls? That always seemed like.
Yeah, there are a few borderline ones.
Were
There's
there?
a lot of slap, slap, kiss. There's a lot of like, this is the thing, that because it's this grey area where, no, of course he doesn't like pin them down and, you know, physically attack them.
Well, I mean,
but there's a lot
I
of.
appreciate they're being directed through a male gaze.
There's a lot
but
of they're not into it.
It's very clear that the
and then
ladies
they are into
generally
it.
rather fancy James Bond.
Well, that's the point, isn't it? That's what you're supposed to think.
Yeah.
That's why it's skewed.
Once he gets on, this is why
the
it's so
viewer.
insidious, because it's like, well, he didn't do anything because she was actually
She's
into
happy
it
now.
after the initial rebuff, but that's not
The same thing happened
how
with
life works.
Poldark, didn't it?
Yes.
There's a rape scene, and then she's enjoying it afterwards. So everyone was like, oh, it just perpetuates
Gone
that
with the
theory
Wind,
that
where Clark
women just say
Gable
no.
rapes
Well,
Vivian Lee's character and she's
but,
into it.
all right, fine. No, this is very interesting. Genuinely, I'm not shutting it down. It's interesting, but to then logically progress with this, are you saying Gone with the Wind then gets rated 15? I mean, that would be slightly
That
absurd,
would be
wouldn't it?
interesting. I mean, there's quite a lot of stuff in Gone with the Wind that would probably
Exactly.
make it.
But there's all
make
sorts
that
of
rating
exactly. There are
justifiable.
problematic things to do with racism and slavery and all kinds of things.
Yeah.
Isn't it important that you show children those things and say, look how the world was seen in the 1920s, 1930s and 40s?
Well, and even in modern films, I think this is, while I understand why they are bringing in these tighter regulations, because the history of the way that these things have been depicted on film has not always been great. I think we've kind of got to a point now where society's changed in a way that that films made now might actually be able to show a more kind of mature and nuanced and politically correct, if you will, depiction of issues like rape and sexual violence. So it's kind of strange that this has come in just at the point where films finally start to be getting a grip on these issues.
Arian is chomping at the bit. Arian, this is the final point.
Well,
You're going to summarise now why the classification of Sausage Party is the most important story of the week, in a week where we've seen the most tumultuous political debate of my lifetime.
Right.
Go.
So what I was going to say was that the BBFC actually changed the C in its name early on from censorship to classification. And I think it is important to bear in mind that what we're talking about is not preventing people from seeing whatever it is that we think is concerning, be it sexual violence or non-sexual violence or any other, or racism or whatever it is. But it is about allowing people to bear in mind that certain things may not be suitable for certain audiences, and then they can make their own informed decision. Let's face it, kids are going to get things on the internet whether you have classifications in place or not. So I do think that it's interesting to look at this change, but I don't think that we need to be worried that suddenly we're going to turn off the tap on sausage parties.
And that is why this story is more important than the opposition stance on Brexit for all of us for years to come. That is it from this edition of The Week Unwrapped. My thanks to Arian McNichol and Rebecca Gilley and Holly Clements, and also to our sponsor, Barclays Corporate Banking. Their industry experts can help your business. Find out more at barclayscorporate.com/theweek. And please be sure to subscribe to this podcast. Your reward is a brand new episode of the show every Friday as you wake from your slumber. Just search for The Week Unwrapped on your app of choice and then hit subscribe. I've been Olly Mann. Our music is by Tom Morby, the producer Matt Hill at Rethink Audio. Until we meet again to unwrap next week, bye-bye.